Welcome back. It's really great to have you with us for another deep dive.
Absolutely. Thrilled to be here.
Before we even get started today, do us a huge favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the show so you never miss out on these explorations. We genuinely appreciate it.
We really do.
Today we're looking at something that is making absolute tidal waves online. We have a massive stack of notes here on an explosive, highly controversial, and honestly ultra-long new ebook.
Yeah, it's called Cancel Culture Canceled.
Right. Cancel Culture Canceled, Ending Repressive Tolerance, Restoring Free Thought by Conrad Riker.
That's the one.
If you follow the manosphere, or if you are part of the men's rights advocacy audience, this incisive and fascinating book is currently being hailed as an absolute essential battle plan.
It's everywhere in those circles right now.
It really is. We are going to dig into the history of our institutions and the author's claims about how they were captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
And just a quick note for the listener. If you want to read it for yourself and make up your own mind, you can buy it right now on Amazon, Kindle, and Google Play Books.
Definitely do that. And you should definitely go follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
For sure. I mean, it is undeniably a text that's generating a massive amount of intense conversation.
Oh, absolutely.
Our mission today is to unpack the architecture of Riker's worldview. We're looking at his claims regarding the history of Western institutions, and specifically his overarching argument that these systems have been fundamentally re-engineered to suppress male biological imperatives.
Exactly. And right up front, we need to issue a mandatory impartiality disclaimer to you, the listener. The source material we are covering today contains highly politically charged content.
Very charged.
Yeah, and we want to make it absolutely clear that we are not taking sides, and we are not endorsing the viewpoints of the author.
Right, we are just the messengers here.
Exactly. Our role today is simply to act as your impartial guides. We're here to convey and analyze the ideas, the data points, and the arguments exactly as they are presented in the original text so you can understand what's driving this massive cultural conversation.
That is the perfect way to frame it. We're simply mapping out the author's arguments to understand the phenomenon of this book. And look, Riker really does not hold back.
Not at all.
He opens the text by declaring a sort of cultural code red. The foundational premise of the entire book is that modern society has systematically pathologized the very physical and psychological instincts that build human civilization in the first place.
Okay, let's unpack this, because he starts right out of the gate with this concept of masculinity. The text argues that masculinity isn't toxic at all, but rather, as he puts it, the oxygen of civilization.
The oxygen, yeah.
How exactly does he illustrate the societal suffocation he's talking about?
So he builds this case by pointing to what he views as massive societal hypocrisy. And he uses very modern, hyper-specific cultural moments to do it. For instance, he spends a significant amount of time analyzing a 2023 TikTok trend that went viral under the hashtag #SoftBoysFail.
Oh, right. I remember seeing snippets of that online. What was the actual dynamic of that trend, according to the book?
Essentially, it was a trend where young women film themselves mocking their boyfriends.
Mocking them.
Yeah, mocking specifically the boyfriends who are exhibiting what culture deems non-toxic or highly sensitive behavior. The videos featured women ridiculing these men for things like opening car doors, crying during minor arguments, or timidly asking for verbal consent just to hold hands.
So doing exactly what they were told to do.
Right. And Riker uses this digital phenomenon to argue a broader sociological point. He says that while modern society explicitly demands men suppress their traditional assertive masculine traits, that same society fundamentally loses romantic and social respect for those men when they actually comply with the new rules.
So the framework here suggests it's a completely unwinnable double bind.
Exactly.
But he argues there's a massive economic and personal cost to this, right? It's not just about getting mocked on TikTok.
Precisely. The text moves from social media to real-world career destruction to show the stakes. There's a fascinating case study in the book about a man named Derek Foster.
Derek Foster.
Yeah, Foster was a highly successful executive who reportedly lost a $2 million gig in Silicon Valley.
$2 million.
The offense: he called a female intern sweetheart during a meeting.
A $2 million job over the word sweetheart? That is a staggering penalty. So what happened to him?
Well, in the framework of the book, this is where the story becomes a blueprint. Instead of apologizing or attending sensitivity training or fading into obscurity, Foster completely rejected the corporate system that fired him.
He just walked away.
He pivoted and built a Manosphere Underground podcast empire.
Okay, for our listeners who might not be familiar with the term, The manosphere is a loose collection of websites, blogs, and online forums promoting masculinity, men's rights, and strong opposition to feminism.
Right. And Foster's new media empire now grosses $50 million annually.
That is wild.
It is. And Riker uses this to illustrate a core theory. When mainstream institutions penalize innate male behavior, highly competent men won't just disappear.
They'll just go somewhere else.
They will build incredibly lucrative parallel systems completely outside of mainstream control.
And a big part of why Riker thinks men will always build these systems is rooted in biology, right? He insists this isn't just a cultural construct, it is physically hardwired into the male brain.
What's fascinating here is how the text incorporates its interpretation of neuroscience and endocrinology to back up these cultural claims. Riker dives into the mechanics of human hormones, specifically oxytocin.
The cuddle hormone.
Right, generally we think of oxytocin as the cuddle hormone, the chemical that promotes bonding and empathy. But Riker argues that male and female brains process these chemical rewards differently.
How so?
He claims that while women typically receive oxytocin spikes from nurturing and social consensus, men actually get their oxytocin and dopamine spikes from conquering challenges, solving complex problems, and optimizing rigid systems.
That is a really specific biological distinction. Does he back that up with real-world examples?
He does. He cites historical data from Detroit auto plants during their peak efficiency.
Okay.
According to the text, the assembly line teams that were led by married fathers produced 30% fewer manufacturing defects than other teams.
30% fewer. That's a huge margin.
Huge. And Riker's underlying assumption here is that fathers are biologically wired by their testosterone and their evolutionary drive to protect their families. So they optimize systems and deliver tangible results.
And he contrasts this sharply with modern corporate culture, which he claims forces these same system-building brains to sit in sterile sensitivity circles.
That's exactly.
He really paints this vivid picture of men being forced into these sterile corporate cubicles, completely starving their primal need for meaningful physical risk. And that transitions into what he calls the invisible labor of men. The book makes a massive point that society takes male sacrifice completely for granted.
The statistics he pulls to support this invisible labor argument are incredibly stark. He points out that crab fishermen, for example, face a 300% higher death rate on the job than police officers.
300%.
Yes. He highlights the men who dangle from freezing rooftops, the guys who install high-voltage telephone poles in the middle of storms.
The dangerous jobs.
Exactly. He is trying to map out the sheer volume of dangerous, dirty, physically crushing jobs that keep the modern world functioning. Jobs that are overwhelmingly, almost exclusively done by men.
I have to bring up the B-Day example because it is so absurd but makes his point perfectly.
Oh, the TED Talk.
Yes. He brings up a TED Talk where a speaker is lecturing the audience about quote-unquote toxic masculinity among blue-collar workers. But then Riker points out the deep irony. Society pathologizes these rough, traditional male plumbers, but then fully expects those exact same men to show up on a holiday weekend to unclog their $800 imported Japanese bidets.
It is a brilliant rhetorical device. The text essentially argues that modern society wants all the utility of male labor. The safety, the infrastructure, the unclogged pipes.
Right.
But without having to offer an ounce of respect to the men actually providing it, society hates traditional masculinity until the lights go out or the basement floods.
So if men are doing all this invisible, highly dangerous labor that keeps society humming, where does Riker believe this cultural hostility actually started? How did we get to a point where the builders are the ones being actively criticized?
To answer that, the book goes all the way back to the 1960s. Riker argues that the dismantling of the nuclear family wasn't an accidental cultural drift, it was engineered. He claims that second-wave feminism had a hidden agenda right from the start.
Wait, so he is drawing a direct chronological line from 1960s feminist theory straight to the modern cultural issues we see today. How does he justify that connection?
He references Betty Friedan, the author of The Feminine Mystique, which is widely considered one of the foundational texts of modern feminism.
Right, highly influential book.
While the book was publicly sold as a path to liberation and fulfillment for housewives, Riker claims that buried in Friedan's private notes was a much darker, Marxist-aligned agenda.
Really?
He alleges her private writings stated that the traditional family unit is inherently a tool of male oppression and must be systemically dismantled for a new societal order to take hold.
And the book claims that this promise of quote-unquote liberation has actually completely backfired on the women it was supposed to help.
Yes, he terms this the feminist paradox. Riker asserts that modern corporate feminism didn't actually liberate women. It simply transferred their dependence from a husband who loved them to a massive corporation that views them as an expendable resource. He argues it enslaved women to corporate burnout and pharmaceutical dependencies.
He brings up some incredibly specific, almost aggressive data points to argue this, doesn't he?
Yes, the text relies heavily on physiological contrasts. For example, he talks about modern corporate women, what internet culture calls boss babes,
Right, the boss babes.
spending upwards of $2,400 annually on Botox to artificially freeze time, while their actual biological fertility windows are rapidly and permanently closing.
That's a harsh contrast.
He contrasts this high-stress lifestyle with National Institutes of Health data, which he claims proves that traditional stay-at-home moms have a 23% lower breast cancer rate.
Because, according to the mechanics of the book, these corporate women are constantly stressed. Their natural estrogen cycles are being absolutely bombarded by chronic cortisol spikes.
The stress hormone.
Exactly. The stress hormone from constantly battling HR about diversity quotas or fighting for promotions. It's a physiological argument against corporate feminism.
Exactly. To explain it simply, the book views trading the biological role of motherhood for a seat in a corporate boardroom as a societal Ponzi scheme.
The Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, the ultimate payout isn't a legacy or a family that remembers you. It's just a LinkedIn eulogy when you eventually burn out.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if you accept his premise that the family unit has been dismantled and women are burning out in the corporate machine, what happens to romance? Riker pivots to how this entire ideological shift has completely cratered the modern dating market.
It's a huge part of the book.
And the stats he drops are wild. He points to a CDC report stating that 40% of young men haven't had sex in the past year. 40%.
It is a massive demographic shift. And he argues that this is the direct, unavoidable result of the sexual revolution colliding with the advent of dating apps.
The apps changed everything.
According to the text, apps like Tinder and Bumble haven't made finding love easier. They have turned human romance into a ruthless, hyper-efficient digital meat market. This brings us to a really crucial concept in his worldview, the beta orbiter economy.
What exactly does beta orbiter economy even mean for someone who isn't deep into internet subcultures?
Think of it like a digital wealth gap, but for attention and intimacy.
Okay.
Riker cites leaks data from dating apps showing that roughly 80% of women on these platforms are exclusively competing for the top 20% of highly attractive, wealthy men.
The 80-20 rule.
Exactly. This extreme concentration leaves the remaining 80% of average men fighting for scraps, essentially acting as digital beggars or orbiters. Men who orbit around a woman's digital presence, providing her with attention, validation, and sometimes financial resources, while receiving zero romantic interest in return.
He illustrates this with a really bleak anecdote, right? The guy from Texas.
Yes, the Austin tech worker. The book details how this average, hardworking guy completely drained his $8,000 savings account.
Oh, man.
He wasn't spending it on dates. He was buying Cameo shoutouts and funding a TikTok influencer's luxury skincare routine through online donations.
$8,000 on that.
Yes. But the moment he actually asked this influencer if she would ever consider meeting him for a coffee, she publicly called him creepy and blocked him.
That is brutal, but it perfectly illustrates his point about the system extracting resources and dignity from average men while offering them absolutely nothing.
So does Riker just point out the doom and gloom, or does he actually offer a way out of this trap?
He does offer a highly specific solution. He outlines a fix through real-world groups like the Offline Kings based out of Seattle. This is an organized men's group that explicitly banned the use of all dating apps.
So they just completely unplug from the digital market. What do they do instead? They focus entirely on real-world competence. The group mandates that members practice cold, approaching women in public spaces, reading physical books, and lifting heavy weights.
Instead of just swiping.
Right, rather than sitting alone in a dark room, chasing the digital dopamine of a screen. And the results, he claims, are staggering. By stopping their funding of what Riker calls the industrial-scale humiliation machine, his group reportedly saw their marriage rates triple within just 2 years.
So, what does this all mean for the broader world? Because if men are unplugging from dating apps, Riker argues they are also starting to unplug from the modern workplace. He claims this anti-male sentiment has completely captured corporate America.
The book argues that woke corporations are trying to walk an impossible tightrope. They are actively exploiting male labor while simultaneously pathologizing the men providing it.
He shares a defining story about a Texas HVAC technician, right?
Yes, this blue-collar worker objected to a new, corporate-mandated gender-neutral bathroom policy on his job site.
And what was his exact response to management?
He looked his supervisor in the eye and said, "I'm here to fix pipes, not pronouns."
Wow.
And he was immediately fired for it. Riker argues this isn't an isolated incident, it is a blueprint. It shows exactly how modern HR departments have been weaponized to reframe basic male labor and traditional common sense as a severe moral defect.
But the text also notes that men aren't just taking this lying down. They are starting to push back in the one language corporations understand. They are voting with their wallets.
The financial consequences are in the billions.
The contrast he provides to illustrate this financial backlash is incredibly stark. He brings up the famous 2019 Gillette razor ad campaign. For our listeners who might not remember, Gillette ran a massive campaign directly lecturing their male customer base about toxic masculinity.
I remember the uproar over that. Did it actually impact their bottom line?
According to Riker's data, that single moralizing campaign cost the parent company $8 billion in write-downs. He claims 45% of their male customer base felt insulted and instantly defected to competitors who simply sold razors without the ideological lecture.
$8 billion.
And then he contrasts that massive failure with the diaper brand Pampers. He talks about how Pampers ran a commercial featuring a dad fumbling and struggling to change a diaper while the mother stood there smugly lecturing him on how to do it right.
Oh, right, the incompetent dad trope?
Yes. And Riker says men across the country notice this casual mockery of male competence. They didn't protest, they just quietly switched en masse to a rival brand, Love's.
Just quietly switched over.
According to the book, this silent boycott caused Love's sales to spike by 18% almost overnight.
The scale of that is mind-blowing. $8 billion lost just for insulting your core demographic.
The lesson the book draws here is crystal clear. Mock male competence at your absolute peril. Riker argues that when massive institutions prioritize progressive virtue signaling over genuinely respecting the people who actually buy their products, men will ruthlessly take their resources elsewhere.
Then he says this exact same dynamic of demonization and gatekeeping is playing out in the mainstream media.
The chapter on the media playbook is intense. He alleges that the media isn't just biased. They actively and deliberately silence male victimhood to maintain a specific political narrative.
He cites the case of James O'Malley, a journalist who Riker claims was fired from the Boston Globe.
Why was he fired?
His offense wasn't fabricating a story, it was simply publishing official CDC data. The data show that 40% of severe domestic abuse victims are actually men.
But the editors didn't want that published.
According to the text, his editors explicitly called the CDC data divisive and terminated his column.
That's intense.
Riker uses this to argue that media gatekeepers will actively censor empirical facts if those facts disrupt the established Marxist narrative that men are always the inherent oppressors and never the victims.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the book takes a really intense turn here. Riker argues that these institutions aren't just abandoning Western men, they are actively trying to culturally replace them.
Yes, that is a core, highly controversial pillar of his argument.
To illustrate this replacement theory, he points to an incident at a prominent school in Frankfurt, Germany, the Goethe-Schule. He claims the school administration decided to cancel Father's Day entirely.
Cancel it entirely. What did they replace it with?
Instead of celebrating fathers, the school hosted what they called Refugee Solidarity Week, where young students were instructed to write poems about dismantling national borders.
Interesting pivot.
Riker frames this event not as a misguided attempt at compassion, but as deliberate cultural arson. He views it as a systemic attempt to erase native male traditions, sever the respect for the patriarch, and replace it all with a globalist progressive agenda.
It is a massive, sweeping claim, and it leads us directly into the final and perhaps most actionable section of his book. He lays out a blueprint for what he calls masculine renewal.
Masculine renewal.
If the schools, the media, and the corporations are all captured, what is an individual man supposed to do? Riker's answer is what he calls the great unplugging.
The great unplugging. He advocates for opting out of these corrupt systems entirely. To explain this, he dives into the MGTOW movement.
Men going their own way.
Yes, MGTOW stands for Men Going Their Own Way. For our listeners who might not be familiar, this isn't just an internet hashtag. It's a specific, growing subculture of men who have decided to completely separate themselves from societal expectations of marriage, traditional dating, and corporate ladder climbing.
Because they view the legal and cultural risks as mathematically unacceptable.
Exactly. He gives a really cool example of this with his buddy Dave.
Oh, the sword guy.
Yeah. Dan is apparently hooked on the digital outrage cycle, but he completely deleted his Instagram, stopped doom scrolling, and taught himself blacksmithing.
That's a serious pivot.
Now he literally forges $3,000 replica swords for history enthusiasts. It's such a powerful metaphor for taking your energy out of a digital system that hates you and putting it into building tangible, real-world value.
Exactly. The text explicitly tells men to build parallel ecosystems. If corporate America despises your nature, build your own economy. He highlights a fascinating alternative business model called Brothers Keeper LLC.
This is the log cabin company, right?
Yes, it's a construction company that exclusively employs 37 homeless veterans to build high-end log cabins. Riker notes the stark differences in their operational model. They have absolutely no HR departments, no mandatory pronoun training, and no sensitivity workshops.
Just work.
It is just hard, exhausting physical labor combined with deep male solidarity. And their employee turnover rate is 0%.
0% turnover for physically grueling labor.
Yes.
And he compares that to modern corporate coffee shops, doesn't he?
He contrasts that 0% turnover with Starbucks, which he claims has a massive 65% attrition rate among its baristas, despite offering comfortable indoor conditions and progressive benefits.
65% versus 0%.
The underlying insight Riker is pushing here is that men fundamentally crave difficult purpose and rigid structure, not coddling and sensitivity training.
That brings up those wild meetups in the Utah Badlands he talks about, something called No Therapy Thursdays.
Oh, those sound intense.
Shooting .50 caliber rifles and eating bison ribs. That sounds less like a psychological intervention and more like an action movie set. But he's saying this is actually a highly functional alternative to modern therapy.
In Riker's framework, absolutely.
Yeah.
300 men drive their trucks out into the desert Badlands. They shoot heavy artillery at junked cars. They grill meat over open fires. And the one strict rule of the gathering is absolutely no modern therapy jargon allowed. No vulnerability pantomimes. It's just men engaging in practical, shoulder-to-shoulder solidarity. They process their trauma by sharing stories without the moderation of what Riker views as a hyper-feminized clinical psychological establishment.
This raises an important question. How does this rough, self-reliant philosophy apply to raising the next generation? Because Riker spends a lot of time talking about how we are currently failing boys.
The book argues that society needs to constantly test boys, not medicate and coddle them. He shares a really poignant story about a 15-year-old named Ethan.
What happened to Ethan?
Ethan was struggling, so he was sent to an intense Montana wilderness program. After 6 months of grueling training, this kid successfully navigated his entire team through a blinding blizzard in the dead of night.
In a blizzard.
Using only the stars, specifically Orion's belt, to find their way back to base camp.
And the contrast with his life back home is just staggering.
Exactly. When Ethan returned home, a capable, confident young man, his local public school was actively holding town halls debating whether to ban the game of dodgeball because it was deemed too aggressive for the students.
Dodgeball.
Ethan's father told the author that society had labeled his son's previous video game addiction as toxic masculinity. But what the boy was actually starving for was to be genuinely tested in the real physical world.
That makes a lot of sense.
Riker uses Ethan to claim that modern boys aren't broken or toxic. They're just completely unchallenged.
And this feeds directly into his ultimate sociological theory of testosterone tribalism.
Yes, testosterone tribalism is the idea that healthy, exclusive male groups, whether they are blue-collar trade unions, college fraternities, or military wilderness teams, are not hotbeds of toxicity.
Right.
Rather, they are the actual load-bearing scaffolding of a functioning, safe society. He argues that when you legally and culturally break those male groups apart, you get urban social chaos and rampant depression.
But when you strengthen them.
When you strengthen them and give them a mission, you get marvels of engineering, like the 1950s Detroit assembly lines humming with male workers, literally building the modern world.
So, to summarize all of this, and man, we have covered a massive amount of incredibly dense ground today. Riker's Cancel Culture Canceled is an intensely provocative, unapologetic call to action.
Unapologetic is definitely the word.
He is explicitly telling his readers to walk away from cultural and economic systems that he believes fundamentally despise them. He wants men to build parallel economies, to master tangible physical trades, and to completely reclaim their biological imperatives from a culture he views as inherently hostile to their nature.
That is the core of it. He is advocating for a complete, unapologetic withdrawal of male participation from mainstream cultural and corporate institutions, aiming to replace them with hyper-competent, entirely self-reliant networks of men.
Which leaves us with a final, really provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over on your own.
Something to think about.
Based entirely on the premises laid out in this fascinating text. If human society truly relies almost entirely on the unacknowledged, highly dangerous physical and systemic labor of men to keep the lights on, to keep the water running, and to build the infrastructure,
Right.
what actually happens to the modern digital economy if this great unplugging reaches critical mass? Could the massive corporate and cultural institutions Riker criticizes eventually collapse, not from a violent revolution, but simply through the sheer, silent apathy of the men who maintain them?
It is a deeply fascinating question to consider.
It truly is the ultimate what-if scenario that the book presents to its readers, forcing us to look at the invisible pillars holding up our daily lives.
Well said.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us for this incredibly deep dive. Before you go, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these breakdowns.
And again, if you want to explore these highly debated arguments firsthand and see the data for yourself, check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ultra-long ebook, Cancel Culture Canceled.
And be sure to follow the author at Conrad Warricker on Substack to dive even deeper into this topic. We will see you next time